Continuing with my lecture on photosynthesis, part 2. Pigments of photosynthesis. There are different kinds of chlorophyll pigments, and there are a couple other pigments for photosynthesis. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. These pigments are, they have a light absorbing head of the molecule and also a hydrocarbon tail, kind of similar to phospholipid heads and the lipid tails, the phosphate heads and the lipid tails. And they are embedded as a collection of molecules in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast. The structure fits the function, so it's an excellent structure-function relationship. Photosynthesis uses different spectrum of light, and this graph explains that. On the y-axis we see the absorbance of light, on the x-axis we see different wavelengths of light, and there are the chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B peaks, also the other kind of chlorophyll pigment, photosynthesis pigment called carotenoids. We see most of the pigments, they best absorb the red and the blue wavelengths of light, and the green wavelength is reflected back, which makes plants look green in color. There are two photosystems of photosynthesis. The photosystems are conveniently named photosystem 1 and 2 in the order of their discovery. Their job is to collect light and absorb that light and pass it on, do its function in the thylakoid membrane. Here we are looking at the electron transport chain of photosynthesis. This happens in the thylakoid membrane, which is located inside the chloroplast. So we are zooming into this tiny portion of the thylakoid, just a single thylakoid. We are looking at the thylakoid membrane and the different proteins that are embedded in the membrane. Outside the thylakoid, but inside the chloroplast, is the fluid-filled interior, also known as stroma. That is where the Calvin cycle will take place. So we have our two photosystems. We see our journey of the electron, which begins from splitting of the water molecule, and the electron goes along this electron transport chain all the way and ends up in NADPH, the electron carrier. So when light shines on photosystem 2, it is capable of splitting the water molecule. Water molecules get split into protons and oxygen atoms, which together forms oxygen gas, which diffuses out of the cell and also through the stoma out of the leaf. The water molecule will generate two protons and two electrons. Those electrons are energized by the light of the sun, and they are carried by electron carriers. They go through a proton pump. This is yet another protein known as the cytochrome complex that's embedded in the membrane. This proton pump is going to use the energy of the electrons and will be able to pump protons into the thylakoid space. The electron continues its journey. It gets re-energized by light again on photosystem 1. Here no water is being split. Water only is split by photosystem 2. Photosystem 1 re-energizes the electron. The electron continues on and ends up by being integrated into NADP+, the electron carrier, and becomes NADPH, which is used in the Calvin cycle. The proton gradient is built in the thylakoid space by the continuous pumping of the protons as electrons pass through the electron transport chain. The gradient is used and the protons will eventually flow out through ATP synthase, which is going to use the proton motive force or the flow of the protons to generate ATP by phosphorylating ADP and inorganic phosphate, which is also going to be used in the Calvin cycle. So far we have seen two products of the light reactions. The light-dependent reactions will be used in the Calvin cycle. To summarize ETC of photosynthesis, ETC used light energy from the sun and it produced two very important molecules, ATP and NADPH, both of which will be used in the Calvin cycle. Photosystem 2 absorbed light, it excited the electrons, and to replace those electrons from the chlorophyll pigment, the same enzyme extracts electrons from the water molecule by splitting the water molecule. Oxygen combines with another oxygen to form oxygen gas, which diffuses out from the thylakoid outside the cell and eventually out the stoma into the atmosphere, and that is the very same oxygen that we breathe. Previously, it was believed that the oxygen came from the carbon dioxide molecule, but we now know that the oxygen did in fact or does in fact come from the splitting of water. Radioactive tracers were used to prove this. So when they used radioactive labeled water, the oxygen that was generated was also radioactive labeled. And when they used radioactive labeled carbon dioxide, the glucose was radioactive labeled. So that proves that the oxygen comes from splitting of water and not from the carbon dioxide. We will look at the two kinds of photophosphorylation. Phosphorylation meaning addition of phosphate, the functional group, to ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So adenosine diphosphate is undergoing phosphorylation in the presence of light, and that's what this word means. It can be of two types, non-cyclic and cyclic. Let us look at non-cyclic photophosphorylation first. So here we are looking at two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. And here is the sun's energy hammering its photon, which energizes the electron to a higher level. This electron goes through the electron transport chain, which is going to pump protons, build the gradient, as a result of which this analogy of the mill, will make ATP through ATP synthase. The electron gets re-energized by a photon when the electron passes through the photosystem 1. This re-energized electron reaches yet another higher level and then eventually ends up in NADPH. So this is non-cyclic because this electron that goes from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1 and then eventually ends up in NADPH, it does not cycle back and hence known as non-cyclic photophosphorylation. PS2 will generate energy as ATP as a result of this kind of photophosphorylation. It will also generate reducing power as NADPH. So these are the two products of non-cyclic photophosphorylation. Cyclic photophosphorylation, on the other hand, is when the electron from photosystem 1, instead of ending up in NADPH, it goes back to photosystem 2 and makes more ATP as a result. And that is known as cyclic photophosphorylation because that electron, that very same electron from photosystem 1, cycles back to photosystem 2 and makes more ATP and less NADPH or no NADPH, which is a good thing because Calvin cycle uses more ATP than NADPH. To make one glucose molecule, Calvin cycle will use 18 ATPs and 12 NADPHs. Here we will see photophosphorylation in yet another model. We are looking at the two types of photophosphorylation. So photophosphorylation, the first type, which is non-cyclic, we see the electron from water, by the splitting of water molecule, goes all the way to photosystem 2 and then through the electron transport chain to photosystem 1 and then finally ends up in NADPH. That's the non-cyclic photophosphorylation, produces ATP and NADPH. The cyclic kind of photophosphorylation, the electron goes from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1 and back again to photosystem 2, which generates more ATP and no NADPH. So here is the summary for photosynthesis, and here are the questions. I would pause the questions and this video and try to answer the questions. So let's go over the answers for the photosynthesis summary so far with the light dependent reactions. Where did the energy come from? It came from the sun, the photons of energy, the different wavelengths. We went over those. Where did the electrons come from? There were electrons in the photosystems which they lost because they got energized and went on the electron transport chain. More electrons were obtained from splitting of the water molecule. Where did water come from? Water came from the roots. They were absorbed by the roots by water uptake. It came from the soil. Where did the oxygen come from? The oxygen comes from splitting of the water molecule. Where did the oxygen gas go? It diffuses out of the chloroplast, out of the cell, and out through the stomata. Where did the protons come from? They also come from splitting of the water molecule. Where did the ATP come from? ATP was generated by creating the proton gradient first and then using the proton motive force and ATP synthase, phosphorylated ADP, and that's where ATP came from. What will the ATP be used for? It will be used for the Calvin cycle. Where did we get our NADPH from? It comes from the electron that gets carried by NADP plus to NADPH and then finally used in Calvin cycle. So in our next video, we will go over Calvin cycle. Thank you.